If you have a Bible, you can turn to Luke chapter 21. That'll be on the screen here in a moment. Luke chapter 21, verses 1 through 4 will be our main text. But before we jump into it, I wonder if you've ever had the experience of reading a Bible passage. Bye, Ethan. of reading a Bible passage, and you're pretty sure you know what the obvious take-home point is, but you just can't get past some sort of lingering side question. Like, take for instance, Jesus feeding the 5,000, right? It's this incredible miracle. Jesus is multiplying bread and fish to feed all of the 5,000 and more people in the middle of the wilderness. It's obvious that this is about marking Jesus out as the one who can do this miraculous thing that only the Creator God can do, and that nonetheless, I'm like, Jesus, really? Like bread and fish? What about like hot wings or guacamole or like Slurpees in the middle of the desert? You could have done so much better. So I don't know if that's ever your experience, to get hung up on sort of a side question, but just fair warning, you are my captive audience this morning, so you're going to have to ride along with me on a little question I have to begin with about our text this morning. Let me pray, and then we'll read Luke chapter 21, verses 1 through 4. Father, I pray that you would send your Spirit here, even as we sang. I pray that you would be here, and you've promised to be here among us when we gather in your name, so that really this is just asking you to make good on what you've already promised. And because I believe that you're alive, and because I believe that you've inspired these words, these ancient words, to be written by human beings, and because I believe that you are here among us, it only makes sense to ask you to help us understand them today. So help us. If our hearts need healing so that we can hear, would you be the healer? And if I need humbling, if we need humbling so that we can hear, would you chasten us gently? Would you lead us on your road of humility gently? And if we need encouragement, if we need emboldening this morning, man, you can do that. Would you come put steel in our spines and fire in our bellies so that we can hear you this morning and be changed? We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Dad, can I borrow my Bible? Thanks. Okay. Luke chapter 21, verses 1 through 4. While Jesus was in the temple, he watched the rich people dropping their gifts in the collection box. Then a poor widow came by and dropped in 2 small coins. I tell you the truth, Jesus said, this poor widow has given more than all of the rest of them. For they have given a tiny part of their surplus, but she, poor as she is, has given everything she has. So here's my niggling side question, right? And this is the first of 3 questions this morning. Why is Jesus watching the giving? Like, that's weird, right? Imagine you're at a restaurant, you've just had a delightful meal, and you are there doing the mental math, which always takes me way too long, before you put the gratuity on the bottom of the credit card receipt. Imagine the server is looking over your shoulder like, that's weird, that's gauche, you don't do that. Why is Jesus watching the giving? Since the beginning of the last chapter, in Luke's telling of the life of Jesus, Jesus has been in the temple courts in the capital city. And he's been doing a lot of teaching as opportunity arises. So mainly, at least the way Luke has structured it, he's bumped into a lot of opposition. Religious leaders, others keep on trying to catch him out. And so in response to him, in response to them, either to direct pressure or indirect pressure, he usually finds these teaching moments. So he teaches his disciples and all who are listening. And that's what's been going on up until this point. And then, my guess is, the way I imagine this is, he's exhausted. He's been teaching out in the hot sun, and he and his disciples go grab some shade somewhere in the women's court, which is, if you imagine the temple as concentric circles, it's like the middle of the concentric circles. And so they're sitting on a curb, maybe, in the shade. And it's in that women's court that they have these 13 sort of trumpet-shaped giving boxes, receptacles, into which people can put gifts, contributions to help underwrite the expense of temple worship. And so Jesus is there with his disciples, and people are filing past, right? Wealthy people like counting out wads of cash, dropping it in, swiping platinum credit cards, and Jesus is there like, weird. And then this one widow walks by, a poor widow. I don't know how he knows that she's poor. Maybe it's the way she's dressed. Maybe, I love to think of this, maybe he knows her personally. Actually, it doesn't just say she's poor. It uses an unusual word for poor. It says penrikos, which I think is where we get our English word indigent. Just kidding. It's where we get our English word penurious, meaning really, really poor. That was a terrible joke. At least Kenneth sort of sniggered. It was like a word nerd joke. Thank you. That's what we pay you for. So she puts in these two little coins. Dink, dink. And Jesus is there watching the whole thing. I mean, that is weird. Why is he watching? Isn't that rude? And he goes on to say this woman has put in more than all the others. Why does he say that? What's going on? I think the reason Jesus is watching, we find in the previous section. So go back with me to chapter 20, verses 45 through 47. Okay, Jesus has just been teaching. He's just been interacting with the religious leaders. They've been resisting him. And then he talks to his disciples within hearing of other people, and he says, watch out for the religious leaders. They put on a really good show of being religious, of worshiping God. They put a really good show on externally. They're all about honoring themselves. But verse 47, look what he says. Verse 47, they are willing to cheat poor people out of their money and then go on, put on a really big show of praying to God about how much they love him. Dallas Willard says, justice without love doesn't do justice to justice. And love without justice neither does justice to love. I think what's going on here is Jesus realizes that watching these people's gifts, watching what people do with their money or someone else's money, shows them something about their hearts. I'll say that again. I think the reason Jesus is watching what people are doing with their money, or in the previous verses with someone else's money, is because it shows him something about our hearts. So here's the second question. What on earth does giving have to do with your heart? There's this cool scene at the end of the books of Samuel, 2 Samuel chapter 24. David, the king of Israel, Judah, he has sinned, and one of the court prophets, a guy named Gad, there's a name for Nameberry, right? Gad McFadden. He comes to David and says, look, here's what you need to do. You need to go to the farm of this guy named Araunah, up in the wilderness, up in the hill country. Go to his farm, go to his threshing floor, and you need to worship God there. So David does. He goes, just as Gad has told him, to the farm of this guy named Araunah, and he shows up, and you can imagine poor Araunah's like, hey, king! Wasn't expecting you. What can I do for you? And the king's like, well, I want to worship God on your threshing floor, which was like the piece of farm land, a flat floor in a high place where wind blew through so that they could separate the grain from the stalk. And Araunah, like any good subject, is like, well, sure, have it. You can have my threshing floor. You can have my cow. You can have anything you want. I got tons of them. Like a good subject. And look at what David says to him in verse 24. 2 Samuel 24, verse 24. The King David says, no, I will not offer to the Lord my God something that has not cost me. I won't give to the Lord worship that hasn't cost me. Now think about that. I mean, all we've been told is that that Gad, the prophet, told David to go there, for David to accept Araunah's generous, maybe arm-twisted offer, it's not exactly cheating him like the religious leaders were doing. Maybe, after all, maybe Gad told him to go there precisely because he knew Araunah would be generously disposed, and this would kind of cut costs, help balance the crown deficit, and it would just be a good stewardship. I don't know. But David says, no. I won't give to the Lord what has cost me nothing. What's going on there? Giving sacrificially is the way we express love. We get that intuitively, right? I think back over my first 12 years, and I got a ton of Christmas presents in those 12 years, but I only remember a small handful of them. And one that I remember, Kenneth will remember it because he got the same one, was the cheapest of all the gifts that I got as a kid. It was a 12-ounce can of root beer. And here's why I remember that one. We were living in England, and root beer wasn't available on the British economy, so it was sort of gray market stuff. And it was given to me by my little sister, who was 5 or so at the time. And add to that the fact that in our house, soda intake was strictly regulated, okay? So my little sister maybe got 6 cans per year. And so it's Christmas time, and Kenneth and I and our other 2 brothers, the 4 of us, are all unwrapping these dense, short, cylindrical, badly wrapped presents. And we open them up and we see a can of root beer, and I think this is the most costly gift I've been given to date, and it's the cheapest one I've ever been given. Here's why. Because my little sister had just given away 4 out of maybe her half dozen cans of root beer for the year to her brothers. Or if she didn't give them away, she stole from the pantry, which was at least as costly in the long run. We remember things like that. It was a deep expression of love. And I think more than just expressing our love, giving sacrificially also cultivates our love. It helps to warm our affections. Think about this. Think when the holiday season is coming up, you guys are going to be giving presents to your loved ones. Isn't there something about dreaming about getting the perfect gift for your spouse, or imagining how you can put together the perfect date, or planning how you can serve someone sacrificially? Doesn't that do something inside you that makes you love them more even before you've given the gift? In evolutionary biology, this is hard to explain because usually it seems that we would be generous because it's sort of, we give a favor to get a favor. We scratch somebody's back so that ours gets scratched. But there's a team of psychologists at VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University, who are exploring what it's like for humans to give gifts to our pets. Because we do this, right? At least today we do this. Because we're not anticipating that our pets are going to give us a gift back. There's something about gift giving, sacrificial, costly dog bones that actually helps us to love the object of our affections more. Isn't that fascinating? At the end of this story with David and the threshing floor, in the telling, it gets told again in 1 Chronicles chapter 21. And in that telling of it, there's this marvelous little detail at the end. It says that up until that point, the tabernacle and the altar for God's people to make worship to him was located in Gibeon. But after this moment, when David gives costly worship to the Lord at Araunah's threshing floor, he says, this is the place where we're going to build the temple. So there's Jesus, sitting in the women's court with the 13 little receptacles around. He's watching people drop in their money. He sees all the rich people put in fat stacks of cash. He sees this woman put in 2 little lepta. Dink, dink. And he's only impressed with her. He says she's given more than all the others. Here's why. On this spot, since its very inception, this spot where God and humans express their love for each other, it's always been about costly, sacrificial giving. Why was Jesus watching the giving? Because what we do with our money and other people's money shows something about our hearts. What does it show about our hearts? What does giving have to do with our hearts? Costly, sacrificial giving expresses love, and it also cultivates our love. Maybe, though, you were troubled by the end of the story, as I was. I'll get there in a moment with our third question. You don't need to put it up on the screen just yet. But maybe you saw an article, came out in April this year, I think. I saw it on the BBC. There was a photo of this guy, Abd al-Qadir Habak, a Syrian photojournalist. Can we put that up? I think it's in the slides. And it ran with this title: "Photographer puts down camera to rescue little child." This was in Aleppo during the bombing. And there were other people besides Mr. Habak on this day of his sacrificial heroism who were doing the same thing. But the reason, I think, that this headline ran and this photo of Mr. Habak ran is because in journalism there's this principle of disinterest, right? A journalistic distance. A journalist is meant to remain some distance from their subject so they can report on it accurately without putting their finger on the scales, as it were. And this day, he did what I think most of our hearts respond to. He felt like he just couldn't stay at a distance and photograph this. He put down his camera and rescued the kid. Think of it this way. Many of you maybe have seen the Planet Earth 2 series that BBC just put out. I mean, that is astonishing. If you haven't seen that, watch that with Psalm 104 in your lap. Man, God is good. And there's that scene you've probably seen, just went viral on the internet last year, of these baby marine iguanas, right, that are hatch out of their egg in the sand and are trying to make their way safely to the rocks where their parents are. And the moment they come out of the sand, there's these swarms of slithering racer snakes that try to gobble them up. And you're watching this. People have said it's in top 10 chase scenes across genres ever. And you're watching this, and I'm just begging to see a cameraman's hand reach down and just pluck the little iguana up and rescue it. But they don't. They've got to remain disinterested, objective, journalistic distance. And so in the same way, the way this scene ends bothers me. Jesus watches this woman put in her 2 lepta, tink, tink, and then it capitalizes on the kind of teaching moment, and then it's crossfade to the next story. Like, Jesus, how did you let that happen? Why didn't you intervene? Why didn't you go up to her and be like, man, you are generous, but you know what? We both know God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. We both know your 2 lepta aren't really going to keep the lights on in the temple for that long. God doesn't really need your 2 lepta, and you really could. So why don't you just hang on to it? But he watches her put in her 2 lepta. It says everything she has to live on. And then the scene ends. Actually, our version of it softens it. It softens it. In the Greek, it says this. It's more literally like this. Out of her impoverishment, she gave her bios, her life. Out of her impoverishment, she gave her all. She gave her everything. She gave her life. How can Jesus stand by? This is the third question. How can Jesus stand by and watch this happen? One of my favorite moments when I do weddings is when it gets to the vows. This last summer I did Caleb and Jenny's wedding, and it was a delight. And there's this wonderful, poignant, intimate moment when the couple are standing there, right? And they're committing themselves to each other. And it's almost like too intimate for the rest of us to be there. It's almost a little voyeuristic, like Jesus watching these people giving. And I'm standing there a foot away as they're committing themselves. And I remember this last summer when Caleb and Jenny were committing themselves to each other. It was this beautiful moment. I am leading Caleb first through his vows, a phrase at a time. And as he repeats them after me, I'm remembering just the substance of my commitment to Jill and thinking about the substance of Caleb's commitment to Jenny. Weighty. We're going at a line of time. He's like, I, Caleb, take you, Jenny, to be my wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. And you know, they've counted the cost. This couple are serious. They're not going into this blindly. Caleb's an engineer. He probably has a spreadsheet. He's counted the cost. And this is what he does. He verbalizes his bios, his life, the weight of who he is in a few sentences of phrases, and he offers it to Jenny. And then it's Jenny's turn, right? She's just seen Caleb give himself to her. Imagine if I were like, hey, Jenny, sidebar quickly. Are you sure you want to respond in kind? I mean, Caleb's a great guy and all, but, I mean, that's big. Do you want to, he went in for sickness and health. How about you go in just for health? He went richer or poor? Poor, or just go rich. Or the honeymoon. How about say, I'll gladly be married to you, Caleb, until we leave Honolulu. If I had said that to Jenny, she would have throat punched me. Why? People are nodding. Yep, she went F. Why? Because Caleb had just sacrificially, significantly devoted himself to her, and that elicits that response out of us. We know we're meant to reciprocate. Costly giving reciprocates. It elicits costly giving. Isn't that the way our God is? I think Jesus was able to watch this woman put in her 2 coins. Maybe he intervened, but it doesn't say he did. I think he could watch her put in her 2 coins because he knew though she had given her all, her bios, she was merely responding to the God who had already given himself completely to her. And in Luke's telling of the story, it's just the very next chapter when Jesus himself is sold out. One of his closest friends, a guy named Judas, betrays the trust. Incidentally, Judas is the one we're told who keeps the money back. He watches after the money of the group, and he weighs his devotion to Jesus against the little stack of silver the authorities offer to give him if he sells Jesus out, decides to sell Jesus out, and just in a few long hours from when this scene happens in the women's court, Jesus is carrying the timber of his own cross past Araunah's threshing floor to go to a rock out in the middle of nowhere where everybody can see him so that he can be hung on a tree. Giving himself for the sake of the world. It says he hung there until late in the afternoon, and with his last breath he said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Giving himself for the sake of the world. All in. Totally devoted. In the Old Testament, there are a ton of different ways, a ton of different modes of making offerings. They're all about a love relationship between humanity and God and between humanity and other humans. Two of these different types of offerings speak of devotion, total devotion. The first is what David did at Araunah's threshing floor. Burnt offering. Just like this meat is totally consumed, God, I am totally given over to you. Second type of offering that speaks total devotion is the drink offering. That wine I just spilled on the carpet can't be unspilled, so to speak. Not getting that back. It's completely given, once and for all. And it's no wonder when the Apostle Paul is reflecting on the gift that Jesus has given in giving himself for the sake of the world in Philippians 2 that he says, drink offering. He has poured himself out. This is what our God does. This is at the heart of who he is. Generous, sacrificial giving. It makes sense. We, made in his image, are meant to be like this, generously responding to his all-in gift to us. Galatians 2:20, Paul is writing, he says, I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. He who gave himself for me. Or in Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 9, he's encouraging the Corinthian church to be generous to other churches. And the way he's formulating is be generous to them because God has been so generous to us. He's the giving God. This is what he does. And he gets to the end of that long section of encouraging them to respond to God's generosity. And it's like he runs out of words. In 2 Corinthians 9:15, he says, thanks be to God for his indescribable, his gift that words cannot express. This is who God is. This is what he does. I love the way Dr. Kelly Kapic frames it. He says, God reestablished our belonging to him. That's academic speak. It just means God got us back, not by taking, but by giving. God reestablished our belonging to him, not by taking, but by giving. That's relationship advice. Many of you know that today we are starting in earnest our Plan to Stay series. Plan to Stay comes from Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 5. Prophet Jeremiah is writing to God's people who find themselves in the big city of Babylon. And he says, plan to stay. Plant gardens, build homes, marry off your sons and daughters. Pray for the peace and the flourishing of this city because in her flourishing, you'll find your flourishing. So Plan to Stay is the title that we've given to this effort we are undertaking by God's grace to fund making this building a wonderful place to be hospitable to our community and a wonderful place to worship the Lord. And if you've been around, hopefully you've come to one of the Plan to Stay community events. If you were unable to make any of those and still have questions that are not addressed in the FAQs that are on the website, reach out to me. We think this is important enough. I would be happy to meet with you. One of the Plan to Stay members would be happy to make time to meet with you. You might know that we've set this target of $1 million to raise $1 million for this project. But what I love, one of our young adults was the first one to come to me and say, Ian, why don't we think about being generous, giving some of this away, some of this being not about what goes on in this building, but about what God is doing in the community. And the Plan to Stay team had the same idea. The elders loved this idea, and so we have designated $250,000 of that $1 million is to be designated for Jesus-honoring projects in our immediate area. I mean, how awesome is that? You're like, pretty awesome. That's awesome. It's so fun to be part of a church that wants to do that sort of thing, that gets that heart. But as the Plan to Stay team has been talking, as we've been thinking about precisely the issues that are at the heart of the text we talked about this morning, we've come on this, we've sort of felt our hearts aligning around this even bigger, more audacious goal. You're like, what's bigger, more audacious than $1 million? 100% participation. If you consider St. Mo as your church home, we would love for you to be involved in this. We'd love for you to participate in this. And I know for many of us, money is tight. You're like, if I put in my 2 lepta, it's not going to keep the lights on for very long. In the scope of $1 million, my 2 lepta is not going to move the needle. Neither did the widow's 2 coins. Dink, dink. And Jesus looked at her gift among all the other gifts and said, she has given the most. God's after our hearts. Next week and the following week, but primarily next week, we're going to get really practical. We're going to talk about modes of giving in the Bible, and we're going to talk practically about here. answering really practical questions. How do you give? How much should we give? What are the best means of giving? What are ways of giving that cost the church less, that cost you less? How do you set up patterns of giving? What do you do if you've never done this before? What if your spouse is not at all interested in you giving money to church? What if you don't make much money? What if you make no money? Man, I've been so encouraged by some of our college students who've already established the pattern of generosity, giving to God's work, when they don't have much of an income. What if you make a ton of money? God can do something with that too. He can keep the lights on. We talk about that. You know, a pastor friend and I were talking about the kind of financial campaign videos that churches do. And understandably, most of these campaign videos are like, look at what we're doing. We are rescuing orphans. We are securing world peace. We are evangelizing the outer antipodes. And yet everyone knows that in reality, a healthy percentage of a church's operating budget goes to personnel. So maybe the video should be like, my kid's getting a flu shot. It's our health insurance through the church. Or maybe the video should be like Jill pumping gas into her car. My paycheck comes to the church. And because you know that, and because I know that, and because I know that you know that, I just want to name it. I want to acknowledge it and say thank you. Thank you that your contributions to the general operating budget of St. Mo's make this a place where I can work. Pastor Ken and Pastor Sam have external supporters who are funding them, which is incredible generosity. But down the road, we're hoping that they too can be funded by the generosity of this church. I say that just because I want to name the awkwardness. But to be clear, the plan to stay effort is not operating budget. It's over and above that. It's us collectively coming together to pay for making this building a wonderful space to be hospitable, to blessing the community, to worshiping God. It's not going towards my salary. It's not going towards any of the other personnel. It's not going towards operating expenses. Just so we're clear on that. But imagine if we collectively participate in this, even if you can only give like $10 a month. Don't count that out. Jesus didn't count that out. St. Leo the Great, he was pope right after our own St. Moses. Okay, so he was 5th century. He probably overlapped at the end of St. Moses' life. He says this. He says, God doesn't give humans the same resources, but he does expect the same affections. He does expect the same affections. God is after our hearts. If we, all of us who consider St. Mo's to be our home, invest in this. Think about the foundation we are laying. Many of you saw the newspaper article that ran in the Sun this last week or the week before about churches closing down across the city, churches shrinking, churches merging. It was sad. It's a gloomy picture in some ways for the church as an establishment across the Western world. And yet I look at that and I think there's got to be a way for things to be different, right? The city is not set up for mega churches. There aren't huge parking lots. Public transit does not facilitate churches of 5,000, 8,000 people in the city that are generating a glut of resources, a glut of surplus to fund stuff. It's small neighborhood churches like this. But if 150 people at St. Mo's, 180 people at St. Mo's, 85 giving units at St. Mo's, if we are all in this, we can sacrificially generate the sort of resources that will help to plant other churches down the road. Isn't that exciting? That could help other churches that are struggling to pay their bills down the road. Isn't that, wouldn't that be amazing? Isn't that the sort of thing we want to be a part of? So I'd encourage you. God is after our hearts. Next week we're going to get super practical. Respond to him in conversation. See if he isn't inviting you to respond to his all-in-generosity of yours. I'll end with this. You guys know what a DTR is, right? Like a defined relationship talk. You have these all the time if you're in high school or later. Yeah, for me it was a lot later. And the divine relationships are always like, so you said you like me. Does that mean like you like me like you like Snickers bars, or does it mean like you like me like me? You said you love me. Does that mean you love me like you love to run, you love to lift, you love to paint? What does that mean? Are we on the same page? That's what it's after, right? That's what premarital counseling sometimes gets at. Are you guys on the same page? Is there equal sort of commitment to this? And sometimes I think we're afraid of going all in because we feel like the lady who gave the last thing she had to the Lord. We're like, am I the only one going in? We're about to celebrate the Lord's table. He has already given his all. Romans 8:32, Paul says this. How will he, who did not spare his own son, how will the God who gave us his most precious thing not also give us everything else? We serve Jesus. Father, we thank you for your generosity that we can't begin to merit. We thank you that we can begin to merit your generosity. By your Spirit's enablement, by courage, by gumption, we pray that you will move in our hearts to help us love you, love each other, love our city, be generous, costly, sacrificial. Pray this in Jesus' name.